Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our latest webinar, The Great Reset, New Legislation that would drive sustainable recovery. Today, we'll be discussing new legislation in the UK, in the US and EU, and what it will mean for companies. Who will be the winners and the losers, and how can companies prepare for the changes that are coming? To answer these questions, Positive Luxury CEO Diana Verde Nieto is joined by two amazing guests from the globally leading law firm, Baker McKenzie. Alyssa Auberger, Chief Sustainability Officer based in Paris, and Reagan Demas, Partner Compliance and Investigations based in Washington. Before we start, I just want to remind you that this webinar will be 45 minutes, including 15 minutes of Q&A, so you can submit your questions anytime through the Q&A box for the panel to answer them at the end. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you so much, Alyssa, Aka, Ali, and Regan for joining us today. And it's a real honor to be here with you again one more time, because there is, so much knowledge that needs to be shared. Earlier this week, I had a call with the World Economic Forum with Christine Lagarde. And Christine, I know, was the first chair in any law firms, the first woman chair in any law firms, but it's probably your biggest admirer, because she has worked at Baker McKenzie for years and years and years. So talking about Davos, obviously Davos dialogue has been happening, and a lot has happening in the world stage. China has set some ambitious carbon targets. The US, obviously President Biden has just signed an executive order for the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And the EU is launching the European Green Deal. So Ali, what do you think this means to business and the pandemic? And I guess the pandemic has shone a light on the human element of this all. So can you share a little bit more on this?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Diana, and thank you to Positive Luxury for inviting us back. Reagan and I are both happy to be here once again. So I guess I just want to jump on a little something you said about Christine Lagarde, because yes, she was the first woman chair of a global law firm. But I think, what people probably don't know is that this sort of pioneering spirit and attachment to giving back to communities, diversity of cultures, and advancing gender diversity actually goes back to our founder, or one of the founders, Russell Baker. So one of the founders of Baker McKenzie. He grew up in Wisconsin, and then he moved to Texas, and then he moved to New Mexico and learned Spanish at a really young age. His wife also grew up in Mexico. And when Russell opened his first law firm, so just out of law school, he actually worked with Mexican nationals to help them with their legal issues. So he was already sort of in that community spirit. And then a few years later, so 1928, a long time ago, he brought a woman appellate lawyer into the firm. So Corinne Rice, who was that woman appellate lawyer, became a name partner at the time when, there were not that many women partners. By the time of Christine Lagarde, there were some women partners, but back in 1928, it was not so common, much less a name partner. So I think, Russell's vision, which we call within Baker McKenzie as the pioneering vision, has certainly had an influence on us. And I think including on our focus on sustainability and on diversity in general, and ESG and all that goes into ESG. We were the first law firm to join the WBCSD. We were one of the few to join the Global Compact to align ourselves to the SDGs. We've collaborated with the WEF. So, we have this commitment to sustainability, but I think it actually, can get traced back to Russell. So I just wanted to say that. So that the good thing for us is that it gives us, I think, a lot in common with a lot of our clients and a lot of companies, because we ourselves are on our own sustainability journey, and that's always been kind of important to us. So I'm going to go back to your question about Davos. So sorry for that little plug for Russell and his pioneering vision. I think what I took away from Davos is that everybody is clearly focused now on climate change. That was across the board. Everyone is focused on it and really greening the world. And I think what we're seeing more and more is that that's a very lofty ambition. But in terms of what's actually going to happen, it's going to depend on business. And I think we heard that over and over during Davos. Business is taking action to reduce their carbon footprint, but governments supporting that movement. So, to take an example from Europe, if you look at the European Recovery Plan, or the ERP, that offers EU funding for a number of, so funding to private actors in a variety of sectors for a number of projects that are really to create a more sustainable environment. So it can be anything for supporting modernization or assisting with climate and digital transitions, fighting climate change, protecting biodiversity, and advancing gender equality. So I think what we're seeing is the whole world is really embracing these types of climate goals. But as with everything, I think only time will kind of tell how we actually make progress. So, my view is whether or not it's aspirational or soft law, as we like to say, right now, it is going to become hard law at some stage. I mean, it's starting here and there, but it is going to become hard law. So recommendations to business for me are really, yeah, if you look at human rights, the pandemic has certainly called attention to the human rights element, not just because of the abuses in the supply chain, but just the economic dependencies of communities dependent on that work in the supply chain. So not just earning a living wage, but just having a job and not being expendable in times of crisis. So I think, again, message to business is taking responsibility for the entire supply chain, knowing what's in their supply chain, and really being able to look beyond tier one. It's fine to look at tier one, but you need to be looking beyond that. And you need to be ready now because you don't want to get caught off guard when things become hard law.
Absolutely, and I cannot agree more with you. I mean, the conversations in Davos has been like really intense on this, and I think businesses are getting slowly the message that is the lip service is not enough. And we had great news in the US. The US has actually joined the Paris Agreement, or rejoined the Paris Agreement, I should say. And with the Biden administration now in place, and the beginning of, I guess it's the beginning of aggressively pursue of all the objectives to do with sustainability. So what do we expect to come out in terms of new legal requirements and or any other expectation concerning sustainability, ESG, and responsible sourcing? I mean, you are the man, Reagan. No pressure.
Thank you, Diana. I'm not sure about that, but I mean, building on what Ali said, the real question here is, to what extent are these soft law aspirations going to become hard law? And so shockingly, of course, there's politics in Washington. And so the Biden administration during the campaign said a lot. I mean, the administration and Biden himself said that climate change was the #1 issue facing humanity. He and the administration in the campaign prior to becoming the administration said they were going to do a lot, but there was a lot of questions as to whether they were pandering to a base on the left. And so what actually will happen? Well, we've seen some things. The Paris Accords, of course, is an obvious one, but there's some other things we've already seen in the first 35 days, right? There's been through executive order, right? So we've seen the reversal of an array of Trump administration environmental policies, including efforts to weaken car emission standards, that these are going to have direct impact on businesses, right? Energy efficiency standards, reversing changes in those, reversing rules, helping industries that you've seen as generally, at the expense of the environment. We've seen some specific supply chain relevant executive orders that we think are going to lead to additional ESG measures, things like requirements to procure US goods when possible. Part of this is sort of the Buy America push, but part of this also is ensuring that supply chains are clean, that supply chains are responsible. So we'll yet to see what meat gets put on those bones, but that's another one. Just 2 days ago, the administration issued an executive order ordering a 100-day government review of vulnerabilities in the US supply chain for critical items, things like computer chips and medical gear or batteries, specialized minerals. This is all part of not just sort of a political play, although part of it is to ensure we don't have like PPE, lack of PPP access like we saw in the pandemic, but it's also just a reset, right? And the administration saying, we're going to take a look at what corporate supply chains look like, and then what we're going to see coming after this are an array of additional regulations. Of course, the administration has said they're going to convene a world leaders together to talk specifically about ambitious emission pledges. And look, the administration, Biden said pre-election that he was going to position the United States to achieve 100% clean energy and net zero emissions by 2050. I mean, these are aggressive targets. Is that going to happen? If it does, it's clearly going to impact companies. But there's also the legislative angle. So that's sort of the promise is So what legislation is on the horizon? Well, there is a draft law that's actually got bipartisan support called the U.S. Slave-Free Business Certification Act that targets trafficking and forced labor. This is a bipartisan issue in the United States, at least. One of the last remaining bipartisan issues on earth, at least here in Washington. They're hard to find. And this would actually require CEOs to certify no slave labor or forced labor in their supply chains and report all instances of this. This would be significant. Think about how deep these supply chains are for companies. CEOs don't know if there's forced labor in tier 2, 3, 4. There's no requirement, oh, tier 1, we don't care about tier 2, as Ali said, right? So this would be significant if it passes. Biden's also said that he's going to demand legislation in his first year of the presidency that would actually establish enforcement mechanisms to achieve some of the carbon emissions reductions that he said. And then there's been two different laws that have been introduced both in the Senate and in the House that are companion legislation to back up that promise, essentially requiring companies to disclose climate information, climate change information with respect to their emissions, how the company specifically impacts climate, how they plan to reduce that. I mean, these are significant, if they pass, significant measures that go well beyond the sort of soft law, hey, you need to disclose if you do anything if you care about the environment. We're talking like, if you don't do this, you're in trouble. And there are specific teeth behind some of these regulations. The final point is just sanctions regimes have long been used to target human rights abusers through like Global Magnitsky Act. And so there's no doubt those sort of tools will be at the administration's beck and call, and those can be expanded fairly easily. And I suspect we'll see that.
Thank you so much. I mean, I guess this is maybe in the short term not great for business, but I think in the long term it's going to be good for everybody. So if this is the case, let's talk about business. What do you think business should be doing to ready themselves for the moment when this is no longer a nice to have, but a must have? Because this is going to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, I mean, I'll let Reagan jump in as well, but I mean, I'd say the first thing is putting something in place that allows you to measure your actions. So whether it comes to measuring your carbon impact or being able to track and trace every link of your supply chain, it's all about data. So, you know, in the past we had things like bribery and anti-corruption that was tracked, but now we have broader questions about the ethics of parties. We have softer things. We have being held liable for the employment activities of third parties. So I think businesses need to be thinking about their entire operational chain and what kind of data they can actually prove. These are things that when they become hard law, they are going to require substantiation. So, I mean, I just want to jump on something that Reagan said, because as some people probably already saw, the commission published its trade strategy for the coming years just last week. So there's a huge emphasis in that on sustainability as well. And some of the things that they're talking about is taking forward initiatives to promote climate and sustainability in the WTO, looking for commitments from G20 partners on climate neutrality, strengthening cooperation on aspects of the European Green Deal, such as, so not just climate, but also biodiversity, sustainable food policy, pollution, and the circular economy, and then promoting, once again, sustainable and responsible value chains. So you're seeing this concept coming up and up again. So there's a companion proposal on mandatory due diligence, which would include taking action and implementing enforcement mechanisms to ensure that there's no forced labor in the value chains of companies. So very parallel action here in the EU on what we just heard Reagan saying about the US, adding the enforcement, so giving us the teeth behind it once it becomes law. So there's also, as I think people are already aware, the European Commission has a legislative proposal that's been out for comment that's on sustainable corporate governance, which includes the mandatory environmental, human, and labor rights due diligence. So this is it goes directly to the supply chain and making sure that things are sustainable and responsible. So I think those legislative proposals, I think the consultation period ended just the beginning of February. So we'll expect the actual legislation to come out later this year. But I mean, I think the question for me and the concept for me is you need to start tracking and recording what you've got, no matter what it's about in your organization. Metrics are really what you need to be focusing on. And if you can't measure, you need to find a way to be able to measure. And I guess, to just go back to the US, I'll turn it over to Reagan, but I mean, there's been some pretty interesting developments at the SEC as well, with a new senior policy advisor for climate and ESG being appointed. And I think that the acting chair also came out with a statement focusing on disclosure, climate related disclosure for public companies. I don't know, Reagan, if you want to elaborate more on that, but I mean, clear tendency that things are becoming required disclosure.
Yeah, no, it's a great. So let me address both two really important points Ali raised. So the SEC piece. So as she mentioned, actually just yesterday, SEC Chair Lee issued an order directing the SEC to enhance its focus on climate change and climate-related disclosures and public filings. But let me just set the stage quick for this. The SEC, right, started as an organization, an entity in U.S. government to just help ensure that investors, the securities and things that investors invest in are sort of safe and all that. The power of the SEC has expanded dramatically over the years. I don't think anybody would have dreamed in a million years you'd have the SEC regulating ESG matters. There are a lot of people that are against that, right? That say, why is the SEC, a securities regulator, telling companies they have to do X, Y, and Z on ESG? It's not just ESG, corruption, right? I mean, a big piece of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is enforced through the SEC, right? Where the SEC says, well, if you pay bribes, we think that investors don't want to invest in companies that pay bribes. So we're going to, issue major fines for you. People go to jail through DOJ companion cases. So on ESG, there's the conflict minerals regulations, right? These are SEC rules that were put in place. And by the way, we'll see a more robust enforcement of those under the Biden administration, no doubt. But what the SEC chair's statement yesterday says is essentially, we're going to continue to push ESG and sustainability. If you're a listed company and you take advantage of the ability to list your shares and raise funds on a US exchange, we're going to put significant requirements on you to tell the market certain things. And by the way, if you tell them things that aren't true, this goes to Ali's second point, you're in trouble, not just from us, because we can, as the SEC, we can regulate false claims. We have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. You may get sued under laws that allow people to sue public companies that say things. So watch out. More is coming. We're going to update. This is what the chair said yesterday. We're going to update these rules. And the 2010 guidance is going to be updated. And there's no doubt it's going to be far more robust. So keep an eye on the SEC. And if you're a listed company, very, very important to keep an eye on what comes out of this, because the requirements are no doubt going to change. The other point on sort of what companies could be doing, there's a lot here, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later. There's a need for sort of risk assessment, compliance program build out focused on ESG in the same way that you as a company are probably doing to deal with other risk on sanctions or corruptions or anything else. But on the claims process, Ali said, let me just emphasize that. It's become so important, not just to know data and know what you can do and can't do, but make sure you have a process in place within your company to vet and manage claims that are being made. So many companies have had different aspects of the company, public affairs, marketing, sustainability as a separate function, merchants or purchasing, and then compliance. And there hasn't always been coordination. It's critical that you have a process in place, that legal has a seat at the table to observe, right? To ensure that claims that are being made are not going to get you in trouble later through lawsuits or through things I just talked about, through enforcement mechanisms on deceptive practices. At the state level, at the federal level, it's lurking everywhere. So that is a really critical component.
Thank you. And obviously, I mean, this is a massively important issue, not just in the US, obviously in the UK, Europe, and in fact, all over the world. And there is new legislation, like you said, Ali, soft legislation that is just passing in Europe for claims. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In terms of claims, I think that what we need to always bear in mind, and Reagan alluded to it, is that whatever claims you're making need to be substantiated, whether it's hard law or soft law. And so a consumer, I think you look at it much the same way, a consumer is going to be more tolerant when you're making your claims if you're being honest about what you're saying and if you're being transparent about what you're saying. I think as we get into the regulatory space and we start seeing more and more of that, I think that we will see a slight tolerance from regulators if you're being at least honest. If you say that you can't make a claim or you can't back something up, I think there's a tiny bit more tolerance than saying if you're just not you're pretending to say something that's true and you have absolutely no idea. So I think you really do need to make, you need to benchmark yourself. You need to make sure you have the data. You need to make sure that you're collecting your data, and you need to be able to substantiate any sort of claims that you are making. And as Reagan said, I can't emphasize it enough. You absolutely need to have legal at that table. As much as these sometimes making claims and product claims or claims about what goes into a product seem to be something that sits elsewhere in the company, legal's not there to say no. Legal is there to help you navigate the risk and make sure that you're not going to get yourself into more trouble. So, there is some tolerance if you're honest, but you also need to make sure that you're cognizant of the risk that you could be taking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And everything needs to be backed by proof, I guess. um, so what will happen to companies that bury the hand in the sand? Those companies that don't come clean to speak, not just listed companies, but actually, in fact, all companies, like medium-sized companies. There's a lot of really big companies that are private today. So what do you think is going to happen? And this question goes to actually you both.
I mean, I'll start by saying that I think, and probably something that we've already talked about in the past, you open yourself up to, companies that bury their head in the sand. It's just a losing proposition. You're opening yourself up to consumer action. You're opening yourself up to class action. So you're opening yourself wide open to a litigation risk. And I think that's something that's just going to amplify over time. We're already seeing it in the States. Um, it's a question of time. We've seen some actions already in Europe. We're seeing actions taken against fossil fuel companies. We're seeing actions taken also by consumer electronics companies. We're seeing a lot of claims when you can't I should clarify, claims in the litigation sense against companies when they can't live up to the claims that they are making about their products. So I just think you're opening yourself up to litigation risk on the consumer side, and you're opening yourself up to risk on the regulatory side. Not to mention reputational risk.
Yeah, it's more and more. It's reputational risk is also rising because the reasonable consumer is just changing, right? They care more about this, and there's all sorts of groups out there dying to sue companies that they think are either doing too little or say they're doing more than they're really doing, right? So there's almost you're almost boxed in on all sides. But let me just hit on a couple of the laws that are on the books now, so we don't even have to go to what the Biden administration will do or not do. I mean, these are the things that even under the Trump administration, companies were being sued because you've got private actors pushing this. So you've got the Alien Tort Statute in the U.S., which is those of you who went to law school in the U.S. know this was like always seen as a dinosaur, a dying statute. Well, the Ninth Circuit, as it's prone to do, has raised it from the dead. And there's, a case where a company has actually been sued, and this has progressed. It's before the Supreme Court now. Arguments were just recently held under the Alien Tort Statute based on supply chain human rights violations in a corporate supply chain. And the question really was the company financing directly involved enough in a supplier that actually could be held liable for human rights abuses outside the U.S. This was 10 years ago would have been seen as a no-brainer dead case, right, under the Alien Tort Statute. There's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the U.S., which does require knowing benefit from trafficking in a supply chain or in a business. But there are several cases that have gotten close to success against companies because what defines knowingly benefiting is changing, right? And if you have new laws that require companies to actually disclose, CEO to certify that we do have forced labor, because it's really hard to know if you have forced labor in supply chains. Let's be honest here. Nobody wants it, but it's hard sometimes. And so if you can't certify that, I know I have it, I'm benefiting, bam, right? Potential case. You've got just traditional sort of tort law for supplier worker injury, that's still being used against companies. And then you've got these indirect risks that we've talked about where I make claims and the claims end up not being true. State consumer protection laws, California is very active law where I used to litigate under this early in my legal career, all sorts of claims brought successfully sometimes against companies. And then you've got, again, the FTC and shareholder litigation. So there's all sorts of tools that are being used. And these are all at the ready with all sorts of activist groups and consumer groups dying to read about your problem on the front page of the paper. And I can guarantee you that some sort of suit will follow. So we'll talk, I think, in a bit about what we can be doing to mitigate the risk of that. And there are some things, but there are a lot of, putting your head in the sand is definitely a great way to be introduced to the intricacies of these litigation tools.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, Reagan, is it's not so much, I think a lot of times people say, "Oh no, but we have the right clauses in all of our contracts, and so we're protected. So all of our suppliers have to live to our code of conduct." I think my gut is that's just not going to work anymore. And the whole CEO statement, they can't say, "Oh yeah, because our contract, which we have here, says that that can't happen." So I think there's also a lot more around how much diligence companies need to be doing, and certainly what we're seeing here is that is going to become mandatory due diligence. So.
Yeah. And what's even more, what you said exactly right. What's even more interesting is that it's, these are traditionally third-party risk, like a lot of risks that companies deal with, and especially in the supply chain. But what's interesting is that in this case, in corruption and some of these other areas, there's not a sense that you can do too much, like an increased liability. It's like, look, you want to make sure you're not dealing with corrupt parties. In this area, that's not necessarily true. No good deed can go unpunished in certain cases. So you have some companies that are just doing nothing, right? And you may just say, look, of course, we're not for forced labor or human rights abuses, but we just don't have the resources to do it, so we don't really know what to do. And of course, you've got legal risks there, right? And there are other companies, very sophisticated, great, committed to sustainability and ESG, who are doing a whole lot. We're auditing our suppliers. We're going to tier 2, tier 3. We're sending our own people out to do audits. We don't trust third-party auditors. We're visiting them, randomly. We're doing great. You know what? You could actually increase your legal risk for that, because you could be seen as directing or controlling supplier activity, which brings in some new potential legal liabilities, because you're actually directing. See what I just talked about, this Ninth Circuit case, right? So there's a balance that's got to be walked, which is a little unfortunate, because most people would say, well, if you're doing more, you should actually lower your risk. That's not really the case now. We'd like to see, of course, legal regimes shape to where that is the case. But right now, you have to walk a fine line to sort of show that you care about this. But be careful about doing too much, ironically, especially if that too much means you could actually be seen as taking on liability from some of the third parties in your supply chain, for example.
This is really fascinating, because we just finished revising the framework. So in the butterfly mark certification is updated every 2 years. And so we are about to launch our 2021 new framework, which is ESG plus innovation. And, it's taken us almost 2 years, because like you said, Ali, all this soft legislation is coming to power. And it's been a lot of the conversations, and it's about how companies will start putting joint targets with suppliers, asking for more, but like this fine balance between having those hard targets or those hard KPIs with leadership, instead of actually doing all the audits and so on in an incrementally crazy way. And it's something that I actually would love to have your advice, or your picking your brain right now in terms of how do you think companies will be able to navigate this? And also, I want to ask you, I don't know, both of you perhaps, it's like targets. So science-based targets now are a must, and I'm so happy that the new science-based target for biodiversity are pretty much there now as well. So how does companies will need to navigate this whole new tension? Because it's not just about doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing plus. So over to you.
Um, I'll start, and then Reagan will fix everything. Um, Science-based targets, I think, are interesting because they do, they set measurable, achievable, and fair targets to sort of split up the global climate objectives, right? So they really break everything down to company specific. I think what's difficult for companies is to know when they're ready to move to science-based targets, because it's not, on the one hand, it's the only way you can have clear measurable progress, but on the other hand, it can be a pretty big step. So I think you need to go there knowing what you're getting yourself into. So I think my reaction would be to say, make sure before you start going that final step that you already have some sort of internal infrastructure in place. So a lot of times, I know that we've even done it with our own carbon monitoring. We haven't gone to SBTs yet, but we know that we are consistently having our carbon footprint audited more and more closely. So I think that internal and then external, moving to external validation of your data is the way you can move yourself to getting closer to science-based targets. But I recognize that for a lot of companies, it's a big leap. So it's not something that you want to take lightly, but there will be a point in time that I think it will become mandatory, because we know that really having those hard objectives is the only way that we're going to be able to actually move the needle on climate change. We're not going to be able to just live on offsets forever.
Hopefully not. And I need to jump because Claudia just slapped my hand because we're going on for too long asking your questions. So let's go and jump onto the Q&As. If you have any burning questions, please pop them on the Q&A box. What about carbon tax legislation?
Ali, I as a non-tax lawyer, I hate to pretend to be one, so I don't want to comment too much on that.
Yeah,
Do you have any
I'm
insight?
even less of a carbon tax lawyer. I do know that everything I seem to sit on, every seminar I seem to sit on this day, when there are a lot of financial people around, say that we absolutely need to move to we need to move in terms of carbon tax and carbon pricing and uniform carbon pricing. So whereas I'm not at all an expert on the carbon tax, so to speak, I do think that is something that will be considered at some stage, but I couldn't even remotely go into details about it. Apologies.
Thank you, though. Are the governments going to stop advertising for greenwashing?
I'm not sure what we mean about governments actually advertising for greenwashing, but I guess I would say governments are going to be less and less tolerant of greenwashing, just in the regulatory landscape in general. As Reagan's already mentioned, there are a number of ways that you can be sued for greenwashing and for saying, for making claims that aren't true, for saying you're doing things that you're not. So yeah, I think it's a question of time before regulation pushes us in that direction. But there's already so much that can be done to attack a green washer that I think there's already a pretty big deterrent to do that.
Thank you, Ali.
Diana, can I jump in, because I noticed you skipped a question from Emma that I do want to address. Can I address that one? I think it's a great question. It's a great question because and again, I live in DC, so I see this cynicism run all the time. The question basically is aren't we just in 4 years going to see the next president undo all of this? And the reality is, yeah, maybe 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, maybe. But the thing to keep in mind in this area is the trajectory. It's sort of like what Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice, bends slowly, but it bends towards the right direction, right? You have an arc here on sustainability and ESG that's clearly moving in one direction. Now, will there be fits and starts? Like the stock market goes up in the long run. It might go down in the short run. So there's no doubt that, we're seeing a major shift, but the shift we're seeing now, keep in mind, under the Obama administration, some of the things we see going on here would have been unthinkable or would have not been done. Obama didn't even do it. And Obama was generally seen as more progressive than Joe Biden, right? So there's no doubt that you'll have some fits and starts with this. And so what companies need to be doing is thinking the long term, right? Because you don't want to be reacting to legislation the day it's enacted. You want to be planning for it as it goes forward. So of course, if we have a Republican administration that comes in, you'll see some shifts, but the clear trend is in the direction of everything we're talking about.
Thank you very much. And I also, Jane has a really good question, which she said, would you say that all this concerning supply chain is only for large companies, as the small companies have very little clout in inspiring the supply chains to be clean?
I'm going to take a stab at that one, Reagan, and maybe you can jump in. And I know that we've talked about it in the past, notably with respect to small and hard luxury brands, where the shorter your supply chain. So I'm not saying that it's only applicable to large companies, but it's applicable to every type of company. I think it depends on the length of your supply chain. So it's easier sometimes for a shorter supply chain, one that you have more control over, to come clean than it is if you have a large supply chain. So I know that there's not a real distinction in my mind between a large company and a small company. You have to make sure that your supply chain is clean no matter who you are. I think it's more a question for me of, if you have a smaller supply chain or a shorter supply chain, it's a bit easier. But unfortunately, I don't think that the rules or regulations that are going to come into effect are going to give you a get out of jail free card if you're a smaller company. I recognize that you have more limited means perhaps, and maybe less clout to force your subcontractors, but I don't think that's going to be a defense.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that's the case. But keep in mind, just for those of you who work for smaller companies, some light at the end of the tunnel here. Yes, larger purchasers have more clout to say, look, you're doing this. We're not asking, we're telling. But keep in mind, in the same way that in ESG investing, it used to be you had to poke around to find funds that actually cared about this. And now it's a competitive advantage for your suppliers to tell you they're doing this. And more that will be the case. So I think even for smaller players, it will soon be, and is today, easier to sort of insist on this stuff. And it's not seen as much as sort of a burden, right? I mean, they're thinking about this in the same way corruption. I mean, asking your suppliers, hey, can you please not pay bribes? Well, we might pay bribes. Sorry, you're too small. Don't worry about it, right? I mean, that's a federal criminal offense in the US, right? So they're just not going to do it. As this stuff progresses, you're going to see suppliers out there telling you, hey, by the way, we do what we can to be clean, but their lawyers are going to tell them to be careful about their claims too, but they're going to be advertising this as a competitive advantage. So there's, again, the arc of this is moving in a direction where I don't think smaller purchasers are going to be in a position where they're sort of behind the 8 ball automatically. But certainly you're not in as good a position. On the positive side, you're not going to be as much of a target for some of these lawsuits we've talked about because you're smaller players, right? They like to go after the big fish, and the companies that you see getting sued are the big fish for the most part.
Well, I just want to thank you both, Ali and Reagan, for the brain power, the energy for the last, wow, almost like 45 minutes. And yeah, I mean, if there's any other questions that we will pass on to you later on that are on the chat that has been unanswered, we will do that. And I just really wanted to thank you so much and hand it over to Claudia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Reagan and Alyssa, for your time today. We hope you enjoyed joining this webinar. Just so you know, so our latest predictions report is still available to download on our website. And at the end of this webinar, you will be redirected to the download page. So please, if you haven't already, get your copy now. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and thank you again for your time. See you soon.